Okay. 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 Good morning, everybody. Does everybody have a packet? Do we have enough? Yeah? There? Okay. Oh, this one, yeah. Yeah. Baruch Hashem, we're learning so much Torah. Okay. So we're gonna jump into to the discourse. Let's review a little bit about what we've said so far, at least on one foot. So we are, I think we're on page 108, maybe the page before it, which is labeled 107. We were in the middle of a conversation that presented a number of analogies and metaphors to try to understand this concept. So the concept on one foot is we have this this, not a dispute, but there is sort of like a difference of opinion in our tradition. We have multiple names for God, right? The two most employed and maybe holiest names that we use are Yud Ke Vav Ke, the four-letter name, which we generally in prayer pronounce as Adonai. Colloquially, we refer to as Hashem or as Havaya. And then we have Elohim, right, which is the other one. And in the more academic breakdown, we have this tradition that Havaya represents, or when it's employed in the Torah, is indicating a expression of chesed, an expression of revelation, of manifestation. Cool. And Elohim represents the flip side of that, which is concealment. Meaning to say that where the Torah employs a term of Havaya, it's talking about God presenting himself or manifesting himself in some way, revealing himself in some way. And when it comes to Elohim, it would be God concealing himself in some way. And obviously there's sort of a spectrum in that deal. Then there is, so that's the sort of more maybe classical understanding. That's the more traditional understanding of how we what our tradition is surrounding there being multiple names for God. Then the Zohar comes along, the foundation of Kabbalah comes along. It says that they're kul echad, they're all one. That there's nothing different about any of the names. They all serve the same function, the same purpose. Which throws a wrench in our whole argument, because it would seem that classically we understand them to be serving the opposite function, right? Where one is revelation, the other one is concealment, and those are opposite forces. So to say that they're the same is definitely requires us to understand a little bit. So that's how we got into this deal. And we started breaking down what is the nature of revelation, of expression and manifestation. What is the nature of concealment? How do they complement each other? How do they contradict one another? How do they work together? Where does that all fit in? So the most recent explanation that we got into, that we really got in the weeds about, was this idea of light and vessels, right? Which is the classic Kabbalistic analogy or paradigm that we use to understand godly things, the godly manifestation is that there is light, which is energy, right? Not physical light, but energy, and vessels, that which contains the energy. And so whereas the energy is infinite and unlimited and totally boundless, it gets contained by the vessels, by the containers, and that is what makes a synergy that makes existence. So we spoke about there being four worlds, and within the four worlds, there are different amounts of light, different amounts of energy versus different amounts of vessels. So more energy versus more concealment, till we get to this world, which is all concealment, right? Where we don't perceive any apparent godliness in this world. And we gave a number of examples to try to understand the relationship between the energy and the vessels. And most recently, the example we gave was about the limbs in the body on page 107. So we talked about the brain and the eye, whereas the soul in this is sort of analogous to God in the sense that the soul is infinite and the soul is totally simple and singular in its expressions. So it has the building blocks maybe, or some capacity to do all these different things like intellectualize and see in some spiritual form. And as the energy of the soul gets contained within the body, that allows for the mind to activate the intellect, the brain to activate the intellect, and for the eye to see physically with a physical eye. And that is the what's it called? The energy in the vessel. Okay. So the last thing that we said, did we talk about the courts? Oh, we said about, okay. So yeah, so we're on the top of page 108. Ela dehinai sanes, v'vnei she'anefesh kedim mislapshus v'guf oz keich haseichel shebei, hu b'china atmi she'ene b'erech lahaskel askolos ke'ela she'maskel acher kach she'hem askolos gashmis b'chlav v'nispasim b'geshem. So just like the soul is in its essence totally singular, is not a composite, is not made up of different parts, which is to say that it would have a ability to see, that it's made up of an ability to see and an ability to hear and an ability to think, right? The soul is simple in its essence, but it is able to, through the concealment of the body and the vessels that the body provides, it is able to activate that the synthesis between body and soul creates our ability to intellectualize. It creates our ability to reflect and to ponder, and also when it comes to being the way it manifests in our eye, able to see. So before the soul comes into the body, oh, this is where we left off, because we were talking about whether it's a linear time thing or whether it's a different level of the soul. Before the soul comes into the body, it has a capacity to see in some sense, but it's seeing spiritual things, right? It's not like it has eyes. But then what ultimately ends up happening is that as the soul is contained within the body, so that transforms into the ability for the eye to see, right? The eye is ultimately just a piece of meat, right? It's technically, maybe scientifically we would say that there's the rods and cones, and so there are some sort of predisposition to be able to see. But if you take a piece of meat, there's nothing that can see, right? It's the soul's it's the soul's fusion with the eye's ability that creates for the ability to see. So what ends up happening is, how does this concealment work? This is the crux of the idea that we had brought till now, which is that concealing the essence concealing the innermost part of something allows for the superficiality of it to shine forth, And instead of thinking of superficial as something negative, we're saying that the superficial ability is what we are relating to, is what we employ. So the soul has this essential ability around sight that it sees in some spiritual sense. And so much of the soul is covered over that what is retained in the eye's ability to see is the superficial expression of the soul's capacity for vision. But it is that in that concealment, what it allows for is the expression, is the manifestation of only the most superficial, which in fact is where our sight comes from. And so too, when we think about conception or our intellect, right? Our soul's essential capacity for intellect is so deep, is so intense, that what our brain is able to do is only the most, like our active experience in that is only the most superficial of that. This was our answer till now. Okay, so on the bottom, page 108, the Zel Klal Gadol, Shekol Gilui Ha'etzem Hu Helam Legabe Azulas. And this is a principle that we have, that every time an essence is revealed, Hu Helam Legabe Azulas, the revelation of essence brings about the concealment for others. And a concealment of the essence is a gilui, is a revelation regarding the zulas, the other. So if we break this down, anytime we've been saying till now that like speech is one of these metaphors that we can understand as well. Because speech is one of these deals where I can't give over my thought. I can't just like think my thought to you. It would be overwhelming. It would be inefficient. It would be ineffective. So we have speech as this medium which takes the intensity of thought and limits it to certain words that then make it engageable, that I can share my thought through speech and you can hear it and then think about it yourself. So Gilui ha'etzem, if I were to reveal the essence of my thought, so that is a helam, is a concealment regarding the zulas, regarding the other. So because of the intensity of thought, if I were to give over my thought the way it were, it would ultimately conceal, it would be ineffective for the other person, for the hearer of the thought, for the receiver of the thought. It would be ineffective and it wouldn't be engageable, right? And so too, halem ha'atzmi, an essential covering over the essence, is a gilui legabe azulas. When I enclose my thought in speech, even though it's fundamentally concealed at that point, there's no more thought there, right? It's transformed entirely into speech. It's taken on a new form. It's infused with the initial thought that I had, but it is not, it doesn't have, the essence of that thought is ultimately entirely concealed within the words, within the sound that is the speech. So that facilitates a revelation for the receiver, for the hearer, for the recipient. Right, so this is the paradox that we're working with, where how opposite revelation and concealment can be, in that they create the opposite for each other. Right, that fundamentally, when there is a concealment, that facilitates for there to be a revelation, and when there is revelation, it requires there to be a concealment. Right, like we were talking about yesterday, that when you have the sun shining in total intensity to the point where it's like super white, bright light, so then you can't see anything, right? When there's all that revelation, then it ends up becoming concealed. Continuing on, page 109, when we call Zeh Yuvon, so from all this we can understand, Lamaila B'Kelim Datzil, Shehem Ma'lim Al Etzem Ma'ar, that we have this spiritual realm called Atzilus, which is totally godly, and you have vessels that are covering over the light, covering over the energy. They're containing the energy, right? Atzilus is the beginning of God orienting towards there being a zulas, towards there being a creation, towards there being something else. So the energy is covered over, umagalam rachatzen yusei, and the concealment facilitates that only the most external part is revealed. And it's only when the essence of the light is concealed that the revelation, that which remains, that which is engageable, is the superficial, the external, and that's able to affect something. What this system of concealment and revelation facilitates is that there can be these degradations in the light, in the energy, in order that it can be engaged with, in order that it can be synthesized and harmonized and facilitate a creation, right? Because that's ultimately the purpose. This is that, like we keep on coming back to, that it's important to remember that all of this entire expanse, the entire spiritual cosmos and the whole system of creation, that in the language of Kabbalah is referred to as a shtalshalos, which means the chain-like descent of energy from that is the process of God creating. All of that is for us to sit here and do a mitzvah, right? The entire spiritual realm, all four worlds, all angels and everything spiritual are all there just as, maybe not byproducts, but as part of the system that is created in order for us to be able to do a physical mitzvah in this physical world, right? And even so too, when we learn this stuff, even though we get way in the weeds with it, even though some of it feels like it's, not even speaking to us and that it's totally foreign and doesn't seem to be related to our human experience at all, it's to fill in some of the gaps that even though it might seem foreign, it might seem like it's speaking to a different experience that's not like our regular Jewish experience. It's to fill in the gaps, to make this system a little more real and to give a little more gravity to what we're doing, that a bagel isn't just a bagel, but a bagel is an opportunity for connection, right? A bagel becomes a vehicle for us to realize something godly and something infinite in this finite world. That's the paradox of being a Jew in the physical world. Okay. Therefore, Elikim, the name that is connected with concealment, is connected with the attribute of judgment. Judgment being really about discipline or about discernment or about restraint, about holding back, about the limit, the brake as opposed to the accelerator, right? The limiter or the governor. Bein kol elam ve'elam atme k'may aparsa shebatzilus sheyesh parsa bein meichel and mides and parsa mavsakas bein atzilus abriya. All the different curtains, right? We spoke about the curtains, right? We mentioned curtains. That God has an interior designer in the spiritual worlds, and there are a series of curtains, right? Curtains are the Kabbalistic terminology on how we talk about these separators, these distinguishers from realm to realm, just like for us, right? We've said the verse tells us that from my own human experience, I can extrapolate to understand a little bit of how it works in the spiritual realms, how it works for God. And we're told that there are these curtains, these delineators between each realm, right? That you have a spiritual realm like Atzilus is the first, is the most godly, and then there's a distinction between Atzilus, that there's a breakdown there. There's a hindrance or a blockage that allows for them to be more sense of self that comes about in the next world, in the world of Bria. There's a blockage there that allows for more sense of self, more sense of disconnect, which allows for Yetzirah. And then finally, another one that creates Asiya, this physical world, right? Each is about stopping the amount of godliness that transfers from one world to the next, concealing it and covering it over so it is more hidden, so it is less sensed, in order that we can live in this physical world. And this physical world manifests no godliness at all, right? You can go 120 years and think that there's no creator, and that it's that evolution is the be all and end all, and that it's a dog eat dog world. And that system is set up because of the way that godliness is concealed. That it allows for us that the godliness is an overt, the singularity is an overt, So if we choose not to see it, if we choose to just live our lives based on evolution and based on things that undermine or ignore the singularity, ignore godliness, we're free to do so. So Elikim is the name that represents this whole system of concealment, this whole system of covering over.
The world corresponds to this rock, like the Binah and the Chokmah. Does it correspond?
Correspond how?
Like the Pilas is like the Chokmah and then the Binah and then the second one is like the Nezek. Or the like Chesed and then like the.
So generally we say that the spheres are considered a template or a set of building blocks that every world has. Everything has, you can map the spheres onto everything. So because they're the 10 fundamental expressions. So every world is comprised of spheres and echoles, the spheres, and also chambers, and the spheres themselves are these containers. When we talk about containers, we're referring to spheres. So we have all these curtains of ben elam abriya yesh parsais v'chein ben briya liyitzira ben yitzira le'asiya v'chein uv'chol elam yesh parsais. So in every world we have these curtains, we have these distinctions and these delineators, right? Just like we can consciously recognize that there's a difference in our experience when we are in our mind or in our head versus when we're in our heart, when we're in our emotions, right? Just like that is a conscious different experience, and those are two separate realms. So too, this is the same idea. And all of this is an expression of Shem Elikim, of the name of God Elikim, which represents the concealment. And then, so that builds the infrastructure for there to be these different worlds and conceals all the godliness, each world according to its level. And then Havaya is the opposite end of that spectrum, which is about the revelation working within that system. Ulafia now, so it comes out. So this would seem to indicate that these two names are fundamentally opposite, right? They're at the opposite extreme of each other. That one is essentially revelation and one is essentially concealment. So this has all been to enforce our question, to understand our question even more so. To say that first we said that it seems like one is revelation and one is concealment, but the Zohar tells us that they're all one, and we said this is a question. And now we've doubled down on the question to say, let's understand how Gilui, how revelation works, and how concealment works a little bit. And now our question is even stronger, right? Now that we understand just how much Havaya is about Gilui, just how much the four-letter name of God is about revelation, and just how much Elikim is about concealment, and just how intense the concealment is to facilitate revelation, and just how intense the revelation is to facilitate concealment. So now, given that, our question is even stronger, right? We've doubled down. So let's continue on. Let's see. We're gonna suggest an answer, and we're going to run with it. We're going to say that Hashem's power to conceal is rooted in his power to reveal. Okay. So we can understand this based on the verse, that it says in the book of Iyov, in the book of Job, that from my flesh I perceive godliness. And similarly, we know in the creation narrative in Genesis, it says that God says that humans are made in the image of God, meaning that we express the same truths and that we can map, just like we map the 10 spheres on our body. And so just like we map the 10 spheres in our own expressions of our soul, so we can extrapolate from all of that and understand a little bit of how the divine works. That humans represent and they reflect the image, the form of above, right? Obviously, God has no image or no form, but it is to say metaphorical in that sense. And more than just a metaphor, are the capacity of our souls, the ability of our souls reflects that. From our soul's expressions, we can understand, because our soul is fundamentally spiritual. And as we know, like we've been studying in Tanya on Thursday nights, our soul is a piece of God, right? Our soul is an expression, is an extension of the infinite, of the divine. And just like we've said that that when it comes to light, that the light reflects the luminary, or the light contains all the elements of the luminary. So the sunlight expresses all the same truths of the sun itself. So our soul contains those same elements, to say that our soul is a microcosm of the infinite, of the creator, of God Almighty, right? Being that it is a chelik elikami mal mamash, that it is a piece of God. So anything that we can say about the soul, we can sort of extrapolate in some way to apply to understanding God a little better as well. When it comes to the powers of the soul, the ability that the soul has, right? So we're saying that the soul is fundamentally singular. It is simple, meaning that it is not a composite. It is not made up of different parts, right? It's not made up of spheres or anything like that. It is singular in that sense, and that it is totally divine, totally godly. But it has abilities, right? It has capacities that are sort of latent to it, that are sort of natural to its programming. So the soul, some of the expressions, some of the capacities that the soul has is the capacity for revelation, the capacity to express itself, and the capacity to conceal itself. Just like intelligence. When it comes to our intelligence and our ability to ponder, to reflect, to extrapolate, to have that flash of insight, like we spoke about with the story with Archimedes. So the soul, our human, our physical ability, our experience of having an intellect going on, rooted in our brain, that is our process of thinking and reflecting that we experience consciously, is rooted in our soul's intellect. That our soul has an intellectual capacity that our physical ability is rooted in. So so when it comes to the way it is in the soul, we use a term that we understand it as something called koach hayuli. Koach hayuli is borrowed, or is at least, it reflects also a Greek term that has to do with potential. He says over here in the English, for example, the power of intelligence which conceives ideas is drawn down from the essential power of intellect within the soul, which is in an unbounded potential for all types of intellectual revelations. So this koach hayuli, they're calling the unbounded potential, it is the undefined potential. So it has some sort of capacity to express itself as intellect, but it is not intellectual. It is so unformed and so potential in its state that it can ultimately come down. It can ultimately, through the system of concealment and of revelation, can come down to express itself as thought or as reflection or as vision. But because the soul is so undefined and so limitless and so singular, singular meaning not a composition, not a multiplicity. So therefore, the essential potential that is in the soul is totally undefined. That's this kayach hayul, this concept. Shahakol nimshach me'akayach hamaskil kiyadua, and all of this is sourced in this kayach hamaskil, in this power for intellect, right? All of the abilities that we have are sourced in the soul's capacity. Yesh b'kayach hagilui, v'hu ligla is called gilui seichel v'eschachmas ve'ezu davar muskol. So the soul has the capacity to reveal itself relative to an intellectual experience. That would be engaging in his chachmas, the flashes of insight, the generation of insight, the eureka moment in the Archimedes story, right? And then there is the Yeshgam Kinkech Hagbola. There's also a capacity to limit, a capacity to contain. Lahagbil Kol Davar Seichel, to contain the Seichel, right? So how would that, let's flesh this out a little bit. Chidua, the Chol Seichel is Svara Be'achrach Sheyeh Gvul Lis Pashtusa, the Ad Pei, Save V'Sulei. Every thought or every concept has to have definition to it, right? There has to be a point where we can say that it applies here and so forth, and past this, it no longer applies, right? If we try to stretch out a concept or a line of thought too far, it ceases to have any definition, it ceases to have any legitimacy to it, right? If we go back to the Archimedes story, when the eureka moment, right, when he's in the bath and he realizes he has this flash of inspiration about the water being displaced, and he jumps out and starts running through the streets naked, and he says eureka, that's all the insight, right? That's all the chachma, that's the wisdom, that's the flash of insight. That is the revelation experience. What follows that is to take that initial thought, that initial flash, and to break it down and to determine in which ways the parameters of its legitimacy, the parameters of how it works, and what makes it a singular thought, a singular concept. That's the Bina experience, that's the Kayach Hagbola, that is the limitation, the concealment experience, or the container experience, right? Which would be the Elikim experience, the Elikim in the metaphor. So in order for it to be legit, in order for it to actually hold water, no pun intended, it has to have limits to it, right? If we can't take this idea of water displacement as a way to figure out the weight or the mass of an object and start applying it to understanding speed or force or something like that, right? Or art or math, right? Or language. It has a limit to it. Each concept has a limit to it, and that limit is where its veracity comes from. That if we stretch that too thin and we start to apply, principles of art history to physics, then it loses that legitimacy. If the So when we stretch a concept too thin and it becomes too abstract and too vague, too undefined, so then it loses its truth, it loses its veracity, its legitimacy. So that's why everything has to have a border, a barrier, confines to it to define it and to give it that form, right? We see the same thing with language, that language words have to have specific meanings in order for them to be intelligible and in order for them to be effective tools for us to share our thoughts, right? Speech is a servant to thought. And if the words don't have meanings, if they don't have agreed upon meanings, if they don't have accepted meanings, so then they become ineffective as tools to share that thought. Okay, continuing on page 117. The chen b'tziruf kama svodas. And if we zoom out a little bit, this becomes true when we are in the process of combining multiple trains of thought, multiple perspectives. Kshayesh svaras neitis lahatir svaras leiser, and kshalei svaras mugbolis leyavel leelam ledegmar lifsei kach v'kach. V'hainu la'asuke shmaitza ali b'deilchasa yevsha ki'im kashayi asporas mugbolis. So when it comes to, for example, how we adjudicate, how we determine the halachic nature of something. For example, we have a principle that the Torah tells us not to mix milk and meat, right? We know that the Torah says it 3 times. That tells us that there are 3 different prohibitions involved in the combination of milk and meat. There is eating it, there is cooking it, and there is deriving any type of benefit from it, which would be something like feeding it to your animals, or if we found a way to run cars off cheeseburgers, that would be permitted. That would be, prohibited. That would be forbidden. So that's on a broad stroke. So let's talk, when we talk about the nuance of it. So if I have a chicken soup and some milk falls in, at what point does it become forbidden, right? What point is too much milk? So we have a system called shishim. We have a principle that there's 1 in 60 creates nullification, that if there's one part per 60 of milk to meat, then that's permissible. If that ratio changes and it was 2 to 60, then that would be prohibited. That would no longer be allowed for consumption. We would consider that not kosher. So that's the sort of the basis of it, right? Within that, you have all these different opinions, all these different understandings about each case by case, and going back through the history of Jewish thought, we have each generation has their own understanding and their own take on how to apply that, right? So that starts with the Mishnah, and then you have in the Talmud, which is exploring the thought, exploring the conversations of the Mishnah. So you have one guy says, what about chicken, right? How do we understand chicken? So everybody says, no, chicken's like meat. And this one guy says, no, chicken's not meat, it's chicken, right? And so they go back and forth and we decide chicken's meat, chicken's not chicken. So, sorry? Yeah. So then on the next level, so then how do we relate to, and this is something more contemporary for us, right? What do we do about soy milk, right? Is that milk? If chicken's meat, is soy milk milk? No, we say no, but that's part of the conversation, right? So each one of these things that we have to have a limit, we have to be able to define our terms in order to understand what we're talking about. If we say all milk is milk, so then that means soy milk is milk, right? But soy milk isn't milk, it's soy milk. It's like water. It's not, it's what we call parve, right? It's not dairy or meat. So we need to be able to define all these things in order to understand what we're talking about. And so all the more so when we're if on something like a halachic decision in which there's all sorts of different things at play, right? We know basic stuff. There's very few black and whites in Judaism, right? It's like basically there's one God. That's the only thing that we all agree on. As soon as there's any type of idolatry, conversation's over, right? But short of that, we're pretty much, everything's basically a spectrum. Everything's basically like a conversation. We have to understand what we're talking about, right? Murder is bad, but if you see a raidef, if you see somebody chasing somebody else with a gun, you're allowed to be a vigilante in that situation, and there's actually a mitzvah to take it into your own hands and to stop that guy, to kill him, right? But there's this week's Torah portion, right? Pinchas took the matters into his own hands, and he stopped this couple from doing something that they weren't meant to be doing. So there are instances where everything is a gray, is a spectrum, right? Is a conversation. The only way we can have those conversations if we're able to define our terms, right? The more definition we have, the more clarity we can have about understanding something. The definition facilitates clarity. So when we're trying to adjudicate something, when we're trying to learn a passage in Talmud and we're trying to understand all the different nuances that are at play when it comes to milk falling into my chicken soup, right? So I have to be clear on each one of those definitions. So you have something like, there's a principle in halacha called Hanan, right? It's an acronym, and it also happens to be my name, but it's an acronym, and it's a principle about how when milk were to fall into the chicken soup, how does it disperse, right? So let's say it falls onto a piece of meat. Does that piece of meat first become treif and then it makes the rest of the pot treif, or does the whole pot work together to nullify the one drop of milk, right? So these are all these principles that we have to be able to define before we understand what we're talking about. The more definition, then we can give a ruling. If we don't know the laws, if we don't know the intricacies of what's going on, and we don't have clear definitions about everything, so then we're shooting in the dark, and we're just going to say it's treif because it's easy to say it's treif, right? There's no rabbi gets paid extra to say that it's treif, right? It's a cheap shot, right? The work comes to figure out a way to find it kosher. That takes a lot of knowledge. It takes a lot of definition, a lot of clarity as to how the principles work, how things are defined. Kim kashayi asbodas mugbals az hure yesuke chasboda haluzu az ulosavas dafka yovel lamitus hadavar v'yochel lifstekach lekach. So the more clarity, the more understanding, and the more definition that a person has around these concepts, the more he's able to determine the truth of the matter and get to the core of the issue, right? All of that comes through definition. All of that is a function of definition. On page 118, and the same is true of a teacher relating to a student. So this is a classic metaphor, a classic analogy that we use to understand the relationship. The transfer of energy is the teacher-student model. So when it comes to a teacher and a student, so in this instance, the way we understand it is that the teacher understands whatever he's teaching to the fullest extent that there is, right? He has 100% of the grasp on the concept, and the student has 0% grasp on the concept. For argument's sake, that's to sort of to make this conception, to conceive of this more easily. So for the teacher to give over the concept, for him to transmit the concept to the student, so he can't just give it to him, he can't just explain it the way that he understands it, right? If you were to sit down with Einstein and start talking about quantum mechanics or whatever Einstein was into, he couldn't just start talking if we had no background for what we were talking about, right? If we were still a little fuzzy on arithmetic, it'd be really hard to talk to Einstein, right? So there has to be some concealment there that we have to first talk about arithmetic. We have to address algebra, what's trigonometry, all of these things, right? That to sort of build that baseline, to sort of build that foundation. So the way we see that here is that the mashpia, the teacher, has to take whatever concept it is and basically suspend the majority of it to only be able to transmit the most superficial external part of it, to build that foundation. So if we're talking about, advanced physics, so the first is that we need to build this foundation. We need to suspend all of that to build the foundation of arithmetic. Then once we have that, we can build the foundation of algebra, and then we can go further, and then we can start to unfold this entire, advanced quantum mechanics deal. But it all is suspended for the most external, the most superficial part to first be revealed. And so too, not only does he have to, when it comes to the actual information, when it comes to the ways in which the methodology that he uses to express whatever he's trying to convey to the student, but also he has to keep his scope narrow, right? That he can't start pulling from all these different other fields and these other understandings that would muddy the water and overcomplicate things, right? Like I just did with kashrus, with the kosher rules, right? Like that, for me, that's a helpful analogy. For you all, that might be like way out of left field and not helpful at all. It might be too unrelated to what we're talking about, right? So that's the mark of a quality teacher, is knowing how to keep that focus narrow to bring in only what is most relevant and most helpful to develop that understanding further in a very graduated step-by-step type of way. So all of it is dependent on understanding the tools, the ability, the vessels that the student has, right? To understand the ways in which the student can understand what has already been integrated, what's the basis of that, of his knowledge, of his understanding, and sort of speaking to that, playing to that. And Nimsa on the bottom, Nimsa sheyesh keach hagbola lahagbilas l'seichel. So it comes out clearly that there is obviously, from everything that we've explained, there's a lot of constraint, there's a lot of defining, there's a lot of limiting in our ability, in our intellectual ability, right? We think maybe sort of naturally we would think that our intellect is that which can ponder and go off into the deepest recesses and just explore and think. But in fact, there's a lot of defining, there's a lot of constraining that is part of our intellect that really expresses the abilities of our intellect, right? I think we often praise those who can make, really far out connections intellectually, right? We see that as like those are out of the box thinkers, right? But it is also our ability to define, to hone in and to narrow the scope that is a fundamental, a key element to effective and successful intellect, to a holistic intellectual experience. So this capacity to define, this capacity to limit, this is also sourced in the essence of the soul's capacity for intellect. So just like the soul is able to express itself, that intellect is a tool, is a form through which the soul expresses itself. The soul reveals itself through the intellect. So too, it expresses itself, or it conceals itself in that same deal as an intellectual experience.
Not to get off the beaten path,
Yeah,
but I know that Torah law is pretty much the basis for all law, even here in the States. But
sure.
how is it that we had two Supreme Court decisions this week, and they weren't all in agreement? So what happened? Is it that they couldn't agree on the definitions of the terms? I mean, they didn't even get past that. If everybody agrees on the definitions, then their vote should all be the same, you would think.
Right,
But if they can't agree on the terms, then still they're at odds.
right.
So where do you go wrong, and where do you?
So there is some element, and I think he's gonna get to this in a bit, that there is, in as much as there is that it's about defining terms, especially when it comes to when you have a question in halacha, you could go to 3 different rabbis and get 3 different opinions, right? That's part of the reason why it says explicitly in halacha that you're not allowed to do that. That once you go to a rabbi and get an opinion on your question, it's binding, right? You could shop around for more answers, but halacha specifically discourages that because of the recognition that there can be different approaches, right? The whole Talmud is full of disagreements on how to understand. This one guy said chicken isn't meat, right? And he was adamant about it, but they still ate at each other's houses, by the way. But that's a different conversation. But there were
actually one relents.
There, in
Even in
some,
the case of Hillel and Shammai,
Right.
eventually
Right.
one says,
right,
I agree that your position is correct.
right, right. So there is, ultimately, it's a relationship between chesed and gvura. And this is, especially when we're trying to understand things of government, it's all about the relationship between chesed and gvura, between the kindness and the discipline, and the marrying of those two, which is tiferes, right? So we think of tiferes as like a one size fits all, but it's really the part of the beauty that is harmony is that it is sort of like a sliding scale. There is some sort of spectrum to it in some sense. And so, and when we look at something like government, everybody's just trying to marry their brand of chesed and gvura in the right way, right? They're coming at it opposite. They're coming at it from, but those are the tools that they have available. It's either so much chesed or so much gvura, and the relationship between the two. But ultimately, there's shivim panim l'Torah, right? We, in a kosher sense, we say that there's 70 faces to the Torah. There's many different dimensions and many different planes of understanding and different schools of thought that can be developed and rationales and logic that can be used, to the point that we can have, the classic line about Hillel and Shammai was that they ate at each other's houses and their children married each other, right? Like there was still a synthesis there, even though there could be fundamental disagreements about, like what did they do Hanukkah? It was probably a catastrophe, right? Hillel says you start with 1 and then go work your way up to 8. Shammai says you start with 8 and work your way down to 1, right? So it'd probably get really messy. They'd probably run out of candles by like day 3, right? So
Day 4, you would
Day
tell
four-
the difference.
yeah. It was 1 day of harmony. So that's always the nature of these things is there can only be so much objectivity in how these are defined. So let's finish this paragraph. שמשם נמשך כהסדך להשכיל בכל דבר מושכל, משם נמשך גם כן כהגבול להגביל את השכל. והם מבחינת חסד וגבורה, right? So this is the chesed and the gvura, the kindness, the revelation, and the concealment, the discipline, the restraint, the definition. Shebekech hamaskil, the מבחינת chasadim shebei, bo kech hagili ligles, right? So there is the chesed capacity, the kindness, right, which is the paradigm for revelation, for giving, for expression. And then there is the gvura capacity, the might, the discipline, the restraint, which is the capacity to conceal, the capacity to defy. I think this is probably a good place to stop. Any questions? Yes.
So I'm just trying to embrace this whole discussion from some place where I can understand it as a whole.
Mm.
And so if I was to subtitle this, it's really about sort of the power of concealment, the power of